So I'm doing another Stalker 302 build, and I thought I'd go over how to disassemble the pedestal style heads, or just any style heads is pretty much the same. You'll either have a bolt here or a rocker adjustment nut, and you take that out and you'll pull your rockers off, and then you need a spring compressing tool like this here. They're pretty cheap, and you'll compress the springs and knock those out. So I'm just getting these prepped up. They only had 40,000 miles on them, 40 or 50, so the valves should be all good. And it's always a good idea, if you're going to reuse the valves and you're not going to grind them or freshen up the seats, which I'm not going to do on these heads. I'm just going to lap these valves back in after I clean them. So I put them in order of the way they came out here in this board, and I'll put the others across here from the other head, but that makes sure I get them back into the same place so they have the best chance for seating properly. So we're going to go ahead and take this head apart here. One other thing is, this is always great stuff when you're trying to degrease a set of heads or a motor. It comes in real handy. It works a lot better than brushing gas on them. Usually I like to boil my stuff, but if it's a cheaper build, I'm just trying to get it done quickly, and it's nothing special. Usually you can get away with gunk in it, but anyway, and you want to buy the heavy duty gunk, the heavy duty stuff, because it really clings on there and makes a difference. So anyway, you're going to take your rocker arms off here, and it really doesn't matter if you keep the same rocker arms with the valves, so that's pretty unimportant. So the trick is here is you want to take this part of the tool and put it right in the middle of the valve on the back. So that's not too terribly difficult. And you want to set your tool up so it's right at the point of where you can just give it a little tug and it should break it loose. And you want to make sure you're centered here, so when you go to pop these keepers, you don't hang up on one. And what I like to do is put something kind of in front here. Sometimes the keepers like to shoot off, and since I'm not doing this in a place where, you know, I can find them where they'd fall into the grass, I like to put something in front. So not an ideal place, but that's all I got right now. So you'll simply compress your ring compressor just like that. I pulled it back, and then you should be able to wiggle it around and pull your keepers out. So you just depress it. There it is. Sometimes the valves are a little stuck. You don't want to really hit them with anything metal. You just want to kind of get in, hit them straight with a piece of wood, and out they come. So I'm going to go ahead and leave those in there for now, so I can make sure to put them back in my board right. But I thought I'd show on these Ford heads, because sometimes you encounter some weird stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get this one compressed. Now, what's interesting about this is it has a keeper that holds the keepers on, actually. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, and these are the intake valves on the Fords. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch socket, because it gets right on that lip, and then give it a few taps, and now the keepers are exposed and I can grab those. And you always want to wear eye protection so you don't knock yourself in the eye. Naturally, I'm not wearing anything, but you know, that's kind of how it goes. One last thing with doing this is you always want to make sure, see, a lot of these valve springs have different retainers. So these are the exhaust valves on this particular set of heads. These are just, I think these are E6s. They're a lot like the E7s and everything else. So that rotating one is the exhaust one, and this one with the extra, the keeper for the keepers, so to speak, is the intake valve. So, and again, you don't want to go beating on that valve with anything metal, so you just kind of give it a few taps in a linear direction, and out comes the valve. So, and again, I'm going to go ahead and clean these all up and make sure I put them back in the right place, and just go ahead and lap them back in. And you want to make sure that when you're doing these swaps that you keep your surfaces clean. You want to make sure you scrape all the gaskets off really well. So we'll go take a look at this head over here. And this is what I would consider pretty prepped. I just did this a little bit ago, so it'll be good enough for the motor it's going on. But anyway, it's all clean and ready to paint when I assemble the motor. But the key thing here is there's no gasket left anywhere on this intake side, because it's really tricky to get those intake gaskets to seal anyhow. So you don't want to be fighting old gaskets. So it's imperative that you sit down with a paint scraper and you can sharpen it. I just sharpened it on a grinding wheel, and you go around and you work all that gasket off. So that's really important. But anyway, that's really all there is to disassembling heads. There you have it. I want to make one more note, and usually, like I said, I boil my heads so I don't really worry too much about all the cleanup. But what you always want to do before you take your heads into the machine shop is you want to get all these gaskets off really well, because when they go to boil it, the boiling process doesn't take the gaskets off. So again, it's imperative that you clean up your mating surfaces so you can get a good seal the next time and you don't have to do it again. Okay, so we're moving on to reassembling these heads on the budget small block motor. So you see the heads are all cleaned up, and we're going to go ahead and reuse the valves. Now these valves here, I kept them in order. See, I drilled a thing into this piece of wood, so I have all the valves in order. So I want to make sure I put them back in their original places. But before you can even do this, you need to check and see if the valves have any valve guide wear where that needs to be serviced or anything of that nature. So it depends all on how much play you feel, and these valves all through these heads don't have much play at all, which isn't surprising, because this motor only had about 60 to 80,000 miles original, so there's not a whole lot of play that can be felt there. And I've gone through all the valves. So the next thing you want to check before you go ahead and reassemble is you want to look at your valves to see if they have a big groove cut in them. If they do, you're going to have to take them into have them ground, and then have the seats matched up for them, and that's quite a bit to do. But with these, they hardly have any lip in them at all. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is put some valve lapping compound in here, the real light stuff, to get them reseated, since I'll never get them in the right rotation that they were originally. So we're going to go ahead and get that stuff and go through all the valves and do that. Okay, so what we're doing here is taking some valve grinding compound, the really fine grade. We don't really want to cut any big grooves or anything of that nature in here. We're just giving it some give to reseat. So we're going to coat the edge of the valve where it seats with the head with this compound. and slide her on in. And now, for about 15 or 20 seconds, you want to take your valve grinding suction tool, just kind of stick it on there, and kind of just go at it. And you'll hear a difference when it's pretty seated in. It'll get real quiet when it'll lose kind of the grinding sound. And then again, you don't want to do this too much. You should just take one pass. If you need to make more than one pass, you need to grind your valves. But when you're done, your valves should have this nice shiny surface with no divots or nicks in it, so you want to inspect that as well as your head seat. So pretty much go through and do that, and then we'll get on to cleaning this all up after we do this to all the valves and reassembling the heads. You also don't want to see anything gouged up in your valve seat, so as you see here, we have a real nice reconditioned seat, to some extent reconditioned, but it should be a good mating surface for the valve, so there you go. Okay, so when reassembling my heads, the first thing I do is I make sure all my valves are all cleaned off, and then what you want to do is lubricate the valve guides, and I like to use this Moly graphite assembly lube because it really stays in place and does a good job when the engine's fired up of keeping everything lubricated until the oil gets around. So I want to first do this and then assemble all my valve guide seals here. And I like to use Velcro gaskets. So you have two umbrella seals, and the taller ones will always be the intake gaskets, or the intake seals, excuse me, and the smaller ones will always be the exhaust seals. But if you're not sure, they always send a good diagram. So anyway, I'm going to go through and get these all oiled up and put on, and like you saw me do, I just run oil up and down the valve stem and then install it, and then I just wipe my excess I have on my fingers around the top here. But and then the valve seals, they just slide right on like that. Okay, so we got everything, all the valve stems lubricated up and all the valve guide seals installed in proper order. So now we're going to go ahead and install our springs and our spring keepers here. And with these particular heads, they have different spring cups for the intake and exhaust valves. So on these particular heads, these ones that rotate are the exhaust valves, and these two-piece deals are the intake valves. So just for the sake of what this is, I'm going to go ahead and put a little dope end around it in case. I don't understand why they're designed like this, because I don't think they necessarily rotate. But just in case we do, I'm going to put a little dope around the area of where it rotates. So then you're going to just set that on there if you can. And you're going to take your spring compressor and you're going to place this on the center of your valve head towards the combustion chamber side. And it's best if you let this go in the chamber and then bring this cup holder down over the top. Sometimes you gotta play with it a little bit, and then once you get it centered up, you just crank that down, and it's usually always good and centered up if you got it in the center of the valve. And then what I do is I take my keepers, and I like to put a little dope on those for the fact that it helps me to hold them in place. Now with these keepers, there's no necessary way to put them in correctly. I personally like to put them in left to right versus up and down. But when they come from the factory or how they were from Ford, they're just all over the place, so I don't think it's necessarily too important. But you can see that the grease helps to hold these in when I go to decompress the spring, so that when I let off, they fall into place properly. So you want to do this nice and slow, and just to make sure they're seated with a soft blow. This is a copper-headed hammer, so it's not going to do any damage. I like to give it a few taps just to make sure those are seated in there. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of these, but it's important that you make sure that you're alternating the spring cups on these heads because they are different. So this is the intake valve spring cup. We're just gonna, I got a spring on there, slide that on there like so. Come around here with our compression tool, get centered in the back of the valve. Line this up here. Compress our valve, and we can let this sit here. Put a little dope on our keepers so they fall into place. You always want to make sure you have this ring compressor centered, and make sure that you have the fatter part of your keeper towards the top. That's real important. You don't want to put them in backwards and get everything all wedged together. So there we go, we're in there, and let her down nice and easy, and they seat right up. Give them a few taps. Make sure they're good seated in there. And if you didn't notice, I kind of do this in steps, where I oil up the valve stems and put the valve stem seals on first so I don't forget and put the rings on without them. So I like to go in steps. It always helps to keep yourself organized. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these on here, and we'll move on from there. Okay, so here they are all completed and assembled. I'm not going to paint them until I stick them on the motor, because after I finish the build I'll wipe it all down and then paint it all together. So it usually works out best if you do it that way, so don't jump the gun with your painting. But anyway, so that's pretty much in a nutshell how to disassemble, clean, and reassemble heads and get them ready for use again. So it should be good. There you have it.